Okay, guys. This is dear friend, colleague, kin, Elizabeth Snyder, and she has done a lot of research in a lot of different things. But one of the things that she is a researcher of, an advocate for, is the ethic and the phenomenology of kink. And so she and I are going to have probably a pretty free-flowing conversation about this.
Yeah.
There was a presentation in your, under the files there. Why don't you guys take a minute and go ahead and pull it up. And it's called Kink Psychology. And so it's a presentation that Liz did a couple years ago?
2 years ago, spring 2018.
2 years ago. And it's fomented some interesting dialogues with other researchers on the same subject. Like I'm remembering AABSS, the researchers that we met with who were talking about the ethics of kink and how the ethics of kink can inform the issue of consent that is importantly an issue in our particular society. So I'm going to let Liz take the lead for a minute and go through some concepts and terms, and then I'm going to be interrupting and asking questions.
Okay.
And then here in a minute, you have a list of statements from people in the kink community that they wish that people who aren't a part of that community would know.
Or wish they would know.
Wish they would know.
Yep.
And so we'll go over that here in a minute. So Liz, was there a couple things about this that you wanted to like define some terms at first, or?
Probably want to define BDSM. So that's bondage, dominant, sadomasochism, or sadism and masochism. Probably want to get that out of the way. BDSM.
Okay. So I'm going to be super ignorant vanilla for a minute.
Okay.
Okay. What does bondage mean?
Bondage can be anything from rope bondage, which you'll see a lot of like shibari and kambaku, to anything.
Okay, well, back up. You're using technical terms
Sorry,
that
sure.
some of us don't know. So what is shibari, what is kamboku, and how are they similar and different? Are they the same thing? Or
Same thing, different terms. So rope bondage, the interchangeable terms are shibari and kambaku. It comes from Japanese culture, has a long history in like military for prisoners, and it's been changed over the years, fetishized in a sense, and now it's used a lot for like predicaments, like for the dominant and submissive types, or for aesthetic purposes, can also be sensual and sexual, all points in between.
Okay.
So that's, you can see that with rope bondage specifically, so
Okay.
that's one part of bondage. You can also see bondage with like plastic wrap, like mummification.
mummification? So actually like wrapping somebody up, immobilizing somebody with plastic wrap?
Yep. Also with, what's it called, like vacuuming latex, where you get into a bed, laying on your back, and the air is sucked out and you're down.
Immobilizing.
Yeah.
So it is a, okay, you've said a whole lot right there.
There's a lot.
Okay, and we may not have time to unpack everything, and if it's unhelpful, then we may have to get on to other topics. But what we're doing is we're touching on some very interesting psychologies here. That it is, it's almost like you drew kind of a continuum there for a minute with this topic, and I'm knowing some of our earlier conversations will probably do this or allow this concept to flow through the rest of
And
our
this is
discussion.
just with bondage itself,
Right.
just one area.
And it probably applies, but you evoked this idea that, okay, so here's the origination, Kinbaku and Shibari,
Yeah.
Shibari and Kinbaku, that originates in the control of prisoners, right? And so therefore there is this immobilization idea, right? Bondage, like holding somebody down, constraining, containing, those kinds of things. And the continuum that you put up was aesthetic,
Yeah.
that there are some people who do it as performative art, and then sexualized, fetishized, that people do it or engage in it for the purposes of sexual arousal or gratification. And then you also evoke the construct of all points in between, that for some people it is more strictly aesthetic. For other people it is both artistic as well as arousing or sexually fulfilling. And then for other people, they're not interested in the performative aspects or the aesthetic aspects as much. They're more interested in the sexual arousal or gratification parts.
Yeah.
Okay, so that implies that there is something beautiful about rope work or about immobilization techniques.
Yeah.
And that some people find it very sexy,
Yeah.
right?
I think one thing too, backtracking a little bit, since this is the first one we're going into, is the rope bondage. It's important to know that it is the most dangerous out of anything in BDSM.
Rope bondages?
Yes.
Really?
It has the most risk profiles with it. You have to know a lot of human anatomy, where the nerves are, what nerves not to hit, where to place the ropes, different tensions. That's how the rope lays across the body. You need it to be certain tight or not tight, depending on what you're building on the body. Also with doing like the uplines, that's what you're suspending from. If they're not built correctly, it's going to collapse. You're going to drop the person, they could break a limb.
Oh, so suspension, so there's some forms of bondage where the people are actually lifted in the air by rope.
Yeah.
Or by something else.
Yeah, that's typically what you'll see with rope bondage. There can be floor work, which is, you're just on the floor doing things, but primarily it is used for lifting up into the air.
Okay. And so I've seen rope work done aesthetically, and the immaculate, like the way in which the knots are structured, the lines of the ropes are straight, it's like very deliberate, and therefore also mindful of anatomy. Like I can imagine somebody who has practiced in shibari and sees bad shibari, it might be very anxiety provoking.
Oh, frightening.
Where you're like, that person's gonna blow a nerve, that person's gonna tear a ligament, or heaven forbid be dropped and break a bone.
Yeah.
Okay, so the rope bondage part has a high risk profile compared to some of the other activities we may discuss. Okay, so here's a mystery, and I don't know, or here's some possibilities are good answers here. In what way, in your observations, what is it about being constrained that is sexy? Like, what is it about being tied up or held down, or tying somebody up, or holding somebody on? How does that associate with the sex part? Like the aesthetic part, and I might be mistaken, but to me at least is self-explanatory.
Yeah, you're creating shapes, like the body is essentially the art form. You're creating imagery with the body.
Yeah.
So that's the most simple to understand.
Yeah, whereas and by the way, like, you've been a part of this course years ago, you've helped me teach this course, you were foundational in some of the course design, so I want to call you out and compliment you for that. So therefore you know that the psychology part of it and the sexuality part of it is part of the discussion we've got going on here. So why do you suppose, and I know this might be guessing, and in your case probably informed guessing, is because you've done a lot of research in this area, how people come to associate sexual arousal or gratification with tying somebody, like immobilizing somebody or being immobilized.
I think the most common one that you see is it's based off of the connection that the two individuals will have. So like the bottom, that's the person being tied, and the top, also called the rigger.
Well, they're called riggers as well as tops.
Yeah, those that tie and practice, rope bondage, that know all the knots and the uplines, those are
and
riggers.
the human anatomy and how to do it safely.
Which bottoms know all that too, because it's their body. But
so they would also know how to respond. Wait, that's too tight.
Yep, that's too tight, or certain areas on their body where they know things are uncomfortable for them, where they might have nerve damage for whatever reason. But a lot of it's based off of that connection. It's that dynamic of you are allowing someone to put you in this situation, and you have trust in them, where your communication is there, that it's almost that level of intimacy that you can see, like sexual intimacy, that's where it can go sensual and sexual for a lot of people. Is very common because of that connection, that relationship that's already built.
So what, if I'm understanding you correctly, that, and I'm going to use some words, and if they don't fit, let's delete them.
Oh no, yeah.
That an inherent part of intimacy is vulnerability, right? And you and I have talked, like at the clinic, Liz is the program director at a mental health comorbid addictions treatment clinic, and you and I have talked about the way in which feelings of closeness are almost automatically sexualized for many people.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we do is we help people distinguish emotional and sexual intimacy. However, sometimes they authentically are the same thing. And so if I am a rigger, then there is potential very sexual arousal and the kind of intimacy it would take for somebody to trust me enough to rig them, to tie them. And therefore that kind of vulnerability, because it puts both of us in a very vulnerable position. The person being tied up, I'm guessing, is obviously in a vulnerable position, but the person doing the tying is also in an extremely vulnerable position, because they could do it wrong and they could hurt this person who trusts them so much.
Yeah, and so that's why you'll see in a lot of kink communities, it should be common practice in all of them. SSC, which is safe, sane, consensual, and
Safe, sane, consensual, and that is a cultural practice, a document, an ethical system.
Ethical system. It's kind of vague, but it's applied in any kink community I've been in and spoken to. They use this one, and also RAC, which is risk awareness, consensual kink. So you're aware of the risk, you communicate that. Like all these things need to happen before whatever it is that's happening.
So.
Because it's oftentimes
Risk awareness.
consensual kink.
Okay. Risk aware. So the risk is obvious. Everybody knows, and it is discussed clearly, explicitly. Consensual, therefore, before any kink activity is engaged in, both parties have talked about what's going to happen, why it's going to happen, what it means, and how it's going to happen.
And what the safe words are, or if there's nonverbals. So safe words, that's if, say you're put in a situation, you know the dynamic, you've talked about it beforehand that we're going to go into these areas where there's a lot of vulnerability. The safe word essentially is, that's too much, I need out.
Okay.
So you agree to the safe word beforehand. There's also nonverbal safe words. I've seen people use like keys, they'll jangle keys, or they have facial expressions they'll use with the top or the person that's in control, essentially. So that those things are all just discussed beforehand, but the safe word or the nonverbals, that's part of the risk awareness and consensual, that those things are agreed to beforehand.
So I can see that if I were a rigger and I'm tying somebody, if I'm using these terms correctly, and the person I'm tying specifies, if my left foot starts to shake, it's too much and we need to back off.
Yeah.
And so that would be a form of a nonverbal safe word, right? A nonverbal safe practice where they may be so into the experience they're having a hard time articulating what's going on.
You can't breathe too. You can, but it's hard.
Well, and so therefore there are other things that they could be doing, and sometimes like if somebody has sufficient body awareness, they might know that if their left foot's wiggling, it's because of nerve constriction.
Yeah.
And so therefore there would be these kind of explicit conversations up front.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like for myself, just a personal example, that it was, I think 3 years ago, I was doing a first suspension on someone. She'd been suspended before, but it was our first time together. Talked with her about it beforehand and explicitly, clearly, this is not sexual, it's not sensual in any way, it's what we call labbing, like we're just going to practice some things. It's more playful.
It's scientific, like you're actually going to see how this works, what the results are.
And I hadn't suspended a lot too, she knew that going in, like we're just going to do some really minimal stuff.
She's helping you practice.
Yeah, and within about 5 minutes, she immediately told me like my left arm's tingling. Like, oh shit, okay, we're going down.
Yeah.
Because that's part of it is tingling. Something's been placed wrong. I placed a band wrong. And if it stays there for too long, it can do permanent nerve damage. But so she had known beforehand that, oh, this is happening, I need to tell you now, like, perfect, okay, let's get down and undo everything.
And so that's a great example of the rack model. Okay, I'm going to tell a story, and I've told you this story before, and it's part of what inspired me for you and I to sit and talk.
Yeah.
And what I'd like us to do is rap about that story and how if we use the rack model, or the safe, sane model, that it might prevent these kinds of things from happening to people later. So a young woman and a young man came into my office just a little while ago, and he wouldn't make eye contact with me. He's just looking at his shoes. He was kind of pale, not naturally pale, but stressed out pale. And hiding is a good word for it. Whereas she's coming in and she's laughing, but it was laughing at pain kind of laughter, laughing at shame or laughing at discomfort. And so I'm sitting there, working on a project, and they come in and sit down and just start talking. And what had happened is recently, it was either the night before or very recently, one of her kinks, and I don't know what this is, air constriction? Choking, thank you, is she feels a great intensity of sexual contact, clitoral contact, vaginal contact, breast contact, while her airway is being constricted, or her blood flow is being constricted. And so she also, on occasion, enjoys anal sex. And so her boyfriend is a rather vanilla fella. Like all this kinky stuff is new to him. And so what had happened is, as I'm taking it, it was the woman on her knees, man behind, doggy style position, and he is lifting her head up and choking her from behind during this particular sexual activity, the rather vigorous one apparently, and she blacks out. And then as she comes to again, because he feels her go limp, and he panics and lets go, she then is able to take a deep breath in, but because she had blacked out, she was not, as she's slowly coming back online again, to use a computer metaphor, that she is not contextually aware. All she knows is that she has to poop, and she has to poop right now. The reason why she had a penis in her anus. And so therefore she panics and jets for the bathroom with him still inside her, which was physically hard. It hurt him when she suddenly disengages that violently. It hurts her to disengage that violently. And so she kind of comes to in the bathroom trying to poop when she can't, because now there's nothing in her anus anymore, right? And so she's laughing about it. This guy's traumatized. Like he feels betrayed because he was assured that this was something safe and fun and consensual, and so
horribly wrong for him.
It would horribly wrong for, somewhat wrong for her, but she had more experience with this and a sense of humor about it. Whereas for him, he's just, you know, and I almost killed my girlfriend. Like, you know what I mean? He was, poor guy was really traumatized. So let's apply the rack model. Like if you'd been there, and I wish you had been during this conversation, I think it would have been very helpful. How would you have walked them through the rack model?
Especially with choking being involved, do they know how?
Okay, there's a way to choke somebody?
Yes, which, that's what's nice about kink communities, that there's a lot of in-person lessons, or online right now because we're in a pandemic, lessons going on how to do these things safely, which, based on what happened, I'm assuming he didn't know the triangle method, which is, so you don't block the airway, you're constricting the blood, and you can put pressure, you know, certain ways.
On the sides, but not on the front? So the triangle method would be something like...
Yeah, so it puts this curve of your palm up against the airway.
Okay, but you're constricting on the sides.
Yeah, constricting on the side, so you can, you know, press that as hard or as... But those things should be talked about beforehand. I'm assuming they may not have to some degree. Especially if he was behind, depending on, you know, how it was.
Because I can imagine it would be hard to do this from behind.
Yeah, it can be done, but it's, you have to talk about those things beforehand and even practice beforehand, which they may not have done. They may not have communicated it fully, and that's okay.
So that's the risk part, right?
Yeah, and those things happen, but it's, you know, him being not involved in kink to some degree, and her having experience, but not, you know, it's a lot of vulnerability. It's hard to talk about these things. It's easier said than done to say, well, here's what you need to talk about. Here's what you need to do. It's very uncomfortable. Those conversations are terrifying when you're actually in the process of having those conversations.
Okay. I have a possible insight, but it might be misplaced. Okay? So the possible insight is, you notice that we're talking about discomfort when it comes to these intimate conversations. And kink some kink practices are definitionally uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And so it's uncomfortable because it's intimate, but it's also intimate.
Yeah.
Right? And so therefore it makes me wonder if there might be a verbal kink. You know what I mean? That there might be a way where people get a lot of arousal about how conversations go and taking conversations in a particular way.
Yeah.
So
definitely, because you'll see humiliation dynamics. Where it's agreed upon that to go into, like, if it's playtime, that's sometimes what kink interactions will be called, or if it's sexual, very degrading, where the individual who's the bottom wants to be shamed, wants to have verbal threats or whatever, but those things are agreed to beforehand.
Put downs, emasculations, I've heard.
Which it is a thing that some people get off on it, or for them, or for a lot of people too, I've seen it based off of that connection that they trust the individual enough to say those things where it becomes very cathartic for them. Maybe they're processing through something, that they had an ex that abused them severely. They now trust this person, different partner, explicitly to say these things to them in a safe space. And that's where you can see the catharsis from kink dynamics. I don't like the word therapeutic. I like the word catharsis more. We talked about this. That therapeutic to me almost makes it seem like you're going into these dynamics with someone's doing therapy to you. Like it kind of blurs a line I don't like too much.
Yeah, now catharsis is certainly a part of therapy, but there's a lot of cathartic experiences we have that have nothing to do with growth and healing in that way.
Yeah.
And so I'm captivated by the image of somebody who, let's say, was very much shamed and controlled, finding it very cathartic to take up the role as the shamer and controller, but in this safe, intimate space, right? Because as we talk about in psychology, and we've talked about this a lot, both in the gender and sex class as well as in other classes that I teach, that a context of a thing informs the thing itself, right? It becomes a different sort of thing. And so so I'm imagining somebody getting this catharsis, receiving the shame and humiliation, or somebody having a cathartic experience giving it.
Yeah.
But what makes it cathartic in a healthy way is that it is in an intimate relationship with clear communication, clear consent, etc.
The risk awareness, consensual.
Very differently than what happened when the person was being abused. And so I appreciate that they feel it's therapeutic.
Yeah.
And so for us though, no, it's more cathartic, right? Because there's no effort to change the underlying issue. That's not the point of kink. The point of kink is, let's take this and have a cathartic experience around it that may help healing, but that's not necessarily the point.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and a lot of, with most, I want to say all, but it doesn't happen all the time, aftercare is a big thing.
Okay, could you define that for us?
Yeah, so aftercare is, it goes into the risk awareness consensual kink and the safe, sane, consensual, that it's agreed to beforehand. Like, if I were to be tying up someone, I would ask them, what are specifics that you want me to do? What are areas I stay away from? You know, tell them this is going to be labbing, or I'm going to try to make this shape. How do you feel about this? You know, talk about those things beforehand. Then I ask them, what type of aftercare do you need? As in, aftercare can be, is it helpful for them when they are suspended down to the ground? Do they need a blanket? Does it help them if they have a glass of water close by, or snacks or something, like if they're lightheaded? Like things that they've experienced before that helps them, or is it helpful for them if someone holds them, like hugs them, embraces them afterwards? But they're very specific things to kind of comfort after, because it is cathartic and you can have that big release. It's often referred to as subspace.
Okay. I want to hold that. That's a very important idea, but I'd like you to finish your idea on aftercare first.
So it's talked to beforehand. It's usually the top or the dom, or it can even be the bottom sometimes. Sometimes the dom will voice things to the top that, you know, for them after the situation that they need some aftercare too. That it's just kind of ways of, to me, it's like endearing doting on people. That you're showing appreciation for them and you're comforting them afterwards. They've had this cathartic release that might, you know, release some endorphins. They're feeling low. You can have an emotional drop afterwards that can sometimes last weeks, depending on how intense the situation was.
Emotional drop?
Yes, it's called sub-drop.
Okay, and I'm not sure I understand what it means.
So what sub-drop or the emotional drop means is, you know, you've had this really intense, you see it with more of the really, really intense BDSM dynamics, like, you know, might be anything from whipping to caning to choking to forcing someone to a point of tears, but you know, it's all agreed to beforehand. But you'll have that big emotional release, it depletes your dopamine and your serotonin.
Oh, okay.
Because
So
it's a big heightened and then it's out, and then you have that kind of high from it, which is the subspace, that endorphins, and then you have
so
that.
is the subspace the high or the low, or all of that is subspace?
Subspace is the high, and then the low is the sub-drop, the emotional drop.
Okay, so like the feeling of exhaustion or numbness or something else.
Yeah, that it, depending on what is it, I've seen people go through it where it does, it lasts for weeks, and part of their aftercare is their top or their dom checks in with them daily. Like,
so how are you doing after that? Was really intense for you?
just to make sure that everyone's safe and that they, you know, feel okay about what happened.
And if it's appropriate to the relationship, reminders of intimacy, affection, verbal care as much as physical. Now, if this is too personal a question, not a problem. In my experience of you, you are a hands-off person.
Yeah.
Like, I have hugged you once in the 7 years I've known you.
Like twice maybe.
Twice maybe?
Yeah.
Right, and although I was raised in a no-touch culture, that's something that I've worked against. I'm trying to be more authentic in my expressions of fondness. But you're no touch. And so I'm imagining what it would be like for, so the rigger, which is you, and if the person you're tying, what is the term for them in the shibari community?
Rope bottom.
Rope bottom, okay.
Sometimes they'll call themselves rope bunny. It just depends on what they identify as.
Okay, bunny, bottom, etc. And they're like, my aftercare is, look, I just need you to hold me for a minute. Then how do you negotiate that space as a hands-off person?
for me personally, I tell them up front that I usually don't do that. I'll do it for you. Like
You will make that exception for them.
because it's
Okay.
someone that I'm putting in a very vulnerable spot. That I've had a couple friends that about 3 or 4 people that I will tie with on a regular basis when I see them. They live out of state, but those are people that I would do that for. Like that's part of the vulnerability is I put them in a vulnerable space, and then that's something that's important to them. Like I can do that. I don't need to be like nope, not doing it, because that to me is not what a good dynamic is for someone, a top or a dom, because it's putting your ego into it, which is, to me, that's a problem for me personally. Others might be different, just me personally.
Well, I'm thinking of ego versus the rack level, but I'm also, boy, the words that are coming to mind I think are less helpful, so I'm going to speak them and let's clarify.
Okay.
There is people walking up and hugging you is disturbing for you, I've noticed.
Not as much anymore.
Granted,
but yeah.
And I don't mean to pick on you when I say this.
Yeah.
But I've noticed that when people know you well and their gestures of affection are authentic, it doesn't bother you at all.
Yeah.
And so therefore, if you have a dear friend who's going to be pretty close to you if you're practicing tying them, right? And they're like, Liz, just hold me for a minute once you let me down. Just hold me for a minute. Well, you've had all of this emotionally intimate, very sharing of trust experience, that therefore it's not them just coming and grabbing you, right? Instead it's more of a soothing, it's more of a close relational kind of connection. So it makes sense then.
Yeah.
Okay. And so thank you on putting the pieces together.
Well, and the way that you phrase it too, that for me, like you've noticed that when I'm very authentic and close to people that the touch doesn't bother me, which if I'm tying someone,
That's
that
a
is
lot of touch.
primarily who I am tying with. It's people, like I have one friend, I've known her for 17 years.
Wow.
And she is one person that if she were to ask me to do anything, like I'd probably do it because I put her in this vulnerable state, I tie with her regularly when I can see her. That it's that authentic relationship, it's that connection that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I think is very important at the psychology of kink. And I hope we'll get to, and probably in the Q&A or the statements and our responses, that as an outside observer who does not have these particular ways of experiencing intimacy, observing it, they lose the intimacy, right? They don't see that part. Like, we might get into age play, which, by the way, part of the reason why Liz and I are having this conversation, why we've had for some years, is as a therapist, I only see when kink goes wrong.
Yeah.
Right?
And so, it does.
And it can. However, non-kink goes wrong as well, right? It's not just single out kink, but like when I'm at the Pride parades and I see age play, like grown-ups running around in diapers and things like that, as a therapist, that increases my anxiety a little bit.
Yeah.
And then when I see, I don't know the term of it, men, rarely women, wearing dog masks on all fours on a hot pavement.
Oh, puppy play.
Puppy play.
Or animal play.
Animal play.
Yeah.
And so that also makes me a little bit worried because it seems dehumanizing. Right?
That, and sometimes that's part of it too. One thing, because we haven't talked about this, the subspace that I talked about, that is something that is very dominant and common in age play and puppy play. It's going into this space where you are vulnerable, almost like acting out, like it's supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be, something different. Like with age play, when you see people kind of revert to a younger age, it's I'm trying to think of a good word for it. It's just a different space. They're enveloping that space for a certain amount of time. It's not their constant 24/7. Some people you will. I think that's very rare where you'll see like age play in a 24/7 dynamic. And same with puppy play.
So I don't know that either of us are experts in puppy play. You're more familiar with it than I am. Okay, if I'm trying to understand this psychologically, like really get into the souls of those involved.
Think of it as a context.
Yes.
Yeah.
That with age play, okay, it's one level of vulnerability if I have two consenting adults with adult levels of power in that particular discourse, right? And I know that gender dynamics complicate power dynamics, et cetera. And we've been talking about that actually in our more recent unit as a critical Foucaultian approach to sex and gender. So age play, if I'm regressing my age, then that increases the power dynamic in a particular way.
Yeah.
And with that increase in power dynamic, if I'm taking up a childish role, or the other person is, then that is like extra intimate because it's extra vulnerable, right?
Yeah.
Now with puppy play, like again, I don't understand it,
Yeah.
but I'm going to take a leap, and I could be way off. With puppy play, it is a version of that, where dogs are dependent upon their owners,
Yeah.
but at the same time it mediates it because dogs have teeth. Like I don't know that that's a part of puppy play, but there is this it would change the power dynamic in a different way than age play would.
Yeah.
And so therefore it would change the nature of the intimacy.
Yeah, I think with puppy play, what might help is the emphasis on the word play. At least I'm
Playful,
not.
play.
I'm not super familiar with puppy play. I've been around it a few times, like a handful of times. I have friends that utilize it. Like my first instance with puppy play was my first kink party ever, and so like, okay, we've got a bunch of puppies in the garage. I'm new to this. I've maybe been involved in kink for a few months.
You're like, oh, there are puppies in the garage?
Yeah, I was seriously confused, like, all right, well, there's dogs here, and I go, into the garage, and there's, adults dressed up as dogs with ears, down on all fours, and the dom in the situation is, and her real job is a dog trainer, and she had been training these puppies for weeks with German phrases, and they went through the whole training to show, and they won awards, and it's just like, watching it was like, this is really fun, this is playful, this is, like, it's almost drama, it's like theater, in that sense, it's very performative.
Yep. Yeah, I think part of my compassion may be misplaced, but, I'm at a pride parade in Salt Lake or Austin or San Francisco, and I'm seeing these people on all fours on hot pavement in July, and I'm seeing the blood on their knees and the scrapes on their hands, and that's when I begin to go, okay,
But they've agreed to it, just save sane consent.
so they've done it.
Yeah.
And I'm glad to hear that play part, because as a therapist I don't get to see that part. And so likewise with age play.
Yeah.
I don't get to see the playfulness. I get to see the cathexes of trauma and the cathexes of childhood sexual abuse and how that's been acted out again.
Yeah, because you see the far end of it when it's gone to trauma.
Oh, yeah, I'm clear over here, right? And so in meeting you, like, a bias that Liz and I have talked about a lot when this subject comes up is, for me, I thought it was trauma kink, right? Psychological unhealthy with healthy.
Yeah.
And you keep pushing the barometer the other way and going, no man, you just see that extreme percentage over here. Yeah. So that's part of my projection into these particular dynamics is the assumption of trauma because of my profession. So,
which is valid too, I think, and it's because it's a taboo subject. From the outskirts, that's what it looks like, is very traumatizing, and so it's a way to working towards removing that taboo. But trauma still does happen in kink, but
that's certainly not the goal. In fact, they're doing what they can to work against trauma and to prevent trauma from happening.
Yeah, in all my years being involved in it, I've at most known of 10 individuals, not personally, like kind of through friends and networking, of highly toxic, abusive people that, have been kind of pushed out of the community, and there's still words of warning going around. But that's 10 out of thousands of people.
Yeah, that those who are even tacitly abusive find themselves marginalized in a pretty hardcore community, because the hardcore community is hardcore because it's got a very soft center. Right? These are people's real feelings, their real emotions, and therefore there may seem to be hardcore things happening, but it's about real emotional feelings. That's how the psychology of kink works, right? Without intimacy, then it stops being kinky and it just becomes abuse. Okay. And so that's a helpful concept, I think, for people who aren't familiar with kink to really try to wrap their heads around. Is the difference between kink and abuse is intimacy. So I want to review a little bit subspace again. They probably got it.
Okay.
I think I get it. Okay, so subspace is the high that can come with certain practices where somebody puts themselves in a very vulnerable position, or even sometimes a very physically uncomfortable position, but that discomfort then is associated with the release of, like, endogenous cannabinoids, endogenous opioids, the endorphins, right, and the endorphin rush that can happen from that.
Think of it too, like if you have just like a really good hard cry, how do you feel afterwards?
And not only that though, you said that and a light bulb just went on, because some people have a hard time crying, and it may be this subspace or the practices to evoke the subspace that can also give them the cathartic tears, right? Because
doesn't always have to be tears too. Like personal example, so I do self suspensions, which that's where I tie myself and I'll suspend myself. And so I did that yesterday, and really, really long, really hard, like my shins are still bruised, my chest still hurts, I've got rope burns on my body, but it was afterwards, it was, I did get that high, I got that release, because it was very physically strenuous, and it was very emotionally draining too. It was because it was a lot of, I need to breathe through this, don't panic, like, 'cause you always have that moment of panic when you're suspending yourself, or I do, I know it's not a common practice most people do.
Well, it's almost like you're self-evoking a panic attack to have the relief of the
but that's
catharsis.
it's meditative for me, and that's
Ah.
why I enjoy doing it, but once coming down, then it was just this like, oh shit, and it was just like, just sat there for a moment just enjoying it, because it had been very physically draining, it had been very mentally draining, just like you'll see with like a really deep meditation. Kind of that catharsis afterwards, that it's just this release of calming.
A good emptiness.
Yeah.
You know,
Yep.
a whole emptiness.
And so that can kind of be what that subspace is, and it is very meditative on both ends, with the relationship, that connection, that intimacy, what's being released, the endorphins, that rush, the calming after effect too, which, aftercare, because you've just had this big release.
And your aftercare yesterday was self-care.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the subspace is the catharsis in this particular way.
Mm-hmm.
And then the sub-low is when...
Subdrop.
Subdrop is when you might feel very tired or drained or something for a period of time.
Yeah.
Sometimes it sounds like it could be minutes, sometimes it could be days.
I need to think too that, say if it's in a situation that it's like a top and a bottom, or a dominant and submissive interaction, where there's that intimacy and that connection, that's a lot of vulnerability. So days after, the bottom might be like, oh no, they hate me. I was in this vulnerable position, I haven't heard from them for 4 hours, they hate me. Like those are normal feelings that you see in like any relationship, of just self-doubt, confusion. And so that's part of the subdrop too. Can be like jealousy, it can be shame, it can be guilt, because you've just had this extremely vulnerable situation with a really high level of intimacy and connection. So that's why the aftercare is so important to any of those situations.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of, so one of the ways in which this conversation started with us was years ago. In fact, around the time you and I met, I had inadvertently become a therapist for part of a kink community that's interesting, not a part of the kink community that you are. They're related and different. So there were some students at Brigham Young University, and I was working with one client in particular who had a couple of particular kinks. In fact, his was suffocation. And one of the kinks that he had was to be rolled up like in a big heavy woven carpet and tight, where it was hot and hard to breathe and that kind of claustrophobia. And it was really intensely cathartic for him to be unrolled. Now, for him it was also arousing to be rolled up, because when he had been rolled up by his, like, he was able to make some connections. Not to say this is universal in kink or even common, but he had been rolled up by his sister's his older sister's pretty friends, because he was bugging them, the 12-year-old, bugging brother. And so these 16-year-old girls wrapped him up very heavily in a carpet and sat down on both ends, not knowing they were risking suffocating.
Yeah. So for him, there was a prior context that became connected to this
right,
one.
And disproportionately, that's what we see in therapy, right? And so, not to say that those are necessarily obvious, it took him a fair bit of work to start to make those connections.
Yeah.
But here it is, he's at Brigham Young, and sexual activity is forbidden. Even self-sexual activity like masturbation is apparently forbidden. So this wasn't the presenting problem in therapy. There were other things going on, but then this became clear. And the way in which we engaged that discourse, he felt very helpful. He felt very loved. He felt very cared for by me. And sub-dom relation, I don't know. You know what I mean, to use some kink language, but very much trying to understand, trying to much care for, trying to see it from his point of view. And then he starts referring his friends in this little G-rated kink community. And so I was using language that was very sexualized language about their kink activities, and you set me straight. And you said, you notice that for a couple of them it's sexual. Yeah. But even this guy, he would really enjoy being this kind of suffocation, where he would be nearly his airway, not his airways, but his body would be really constricted. And it was very cathartic for him to be released. And sometimes he would masturbate, but that wasn't necessarily the point. And you were very quick to point that out. And then how for many of these other people, it might have sexual overtones, but sex wasn't the point, right? Whereas for a few of them it was, and you kept hitting me with that. And it took you a year, I think, before I finally got it.
So I think that's a common misconception that people just assume like, oh, BDSM kink, they're all just having sex all the time.
They're just like nymphomania.
It's actually really rare. A lot of it is more about that space. It's about the connection. That's one thing a lot of my kink friends have said too. Like they all are referring to vanilla, like people that do not practice kink. It's like they all just assume we're just all having sex all the time, which is not true at all. It's actually, it can happen, but it's rare.
Yeah, because I've noticed that there's a negative correlation between promiscuity and kink. And that, again, kind of flies against the cultural preconceptions, right? The kink is all about sex all the time. In fact, you shared a story with me, I think just yesterday, about going to kink parties and how rarely you have seen sex unfold out of those activities. Remind me the ratios.
Handful of parties that I've been to, play parties, kink parties, seeing everything from blood play, which we don't need to get into that, and needle play, and waterboarding, and a lot of different varying degrees of intensities. I've seen sex once, and it was for 10 minutes.
And you've been part of the kink community for how long?
4 years now, I think, 4 or 5 years.
So that few a time and that, so it backs up to the point that, and the other thing, and this insight may be misplaced. Like, I'm going to use the example of rope work. That if I am tying somebody up, the amount of investment of time, the amount of investment in material, the amount of investment I'm putting into that one person, even if it is sexual, means it's not going to happen very often. Just because of the sheer amount of setup and care, conversations, aftercare, everything else.
Or it can, but it's explicitly talked to about beforehand.
What is expected, what's going on.
And if it is intended to go sexual, what type of sexual acts, at what point, it's all talked to about beforehand.
Oh, okay. And so again, that's more time consuming than a Tinder hookup. So there's some colleagues of ours at the University of Chicago, and so we met them at AABSS 3 years ago?
3 years ago,
And they had given this presentation at this particular conference about the ways in which the ethic of kink, and really unfolding the ethics of kink, and that's one of the things they wanted to talk to us about. And we had some lovely conversations. And then how that can inform to sexual practices broadly. And so I was thinking about how much drama I see in people's lives, even if they're super vanilla, that they're not following the kink ethic, right? So how many young men or young women I know who are on a Tinder hookup, Grindr hookup, whatever else, and there's that expectation for sex they don't want, but they do it anyway because it's expected, right? Whereas if they're following the rack model, there would be a lot of conversations before any sexual contact happened, if it happened at all. And when you start getting in touch with who you are as a person and what you need, it might be what you need is emotional connection more than sexual, or both emotional, sexual, or just sexual, but that would be communicated about. And so I'm thinking how much less drama that would cause people. Now it also costs me business as a therapist, so I'm not sure how much I should be promulgating this. But the risk awareness, consensual.
We see it taught in universities and high schools how important consent is, but it's still not practiced as widely and as much as I think it should be, because it's hard to talk about. It's hard when you're on like a Tinder date or Grindr date or whatever to ask someone if it's okay to kiss them. Usually people just go and do it.
Just go for broke.
Yeah, and then you see in a lot of kink that it's assumed and it should be common practice that consent is always talked about at every single point, and when consent is revoked and why. That's something normal that should be talked about in everyone's lives, I think.
And so there's also something that I've been confronting, that certain forms of kink are risky in particular ways, right? And those are similar to and different from the risks of everyday intimacies, right? What kink brings to the table is a clear discourse on empowering and encouraging people to talk about the dangerous vulnerabilities, the dangerous intimacies, right? Whereas in kink, it's almost like they've been put in a position of ethically having to. But now because they've have to, they've developed language and discourse that would be very helpful for even rather vanilla preferences, right? Let's talk about this, because A lot of what my therapy is for people who are in the dating world is teaching them how to use this language. And it does frighten them, and it does scare them, because when we put our hearts and souls on the table, it's far more risky than we put our genitals on the table. But the genitals are connected to the heart, and that's what keeps me in business as a therapist. So, okay, let's see if, because there's a lot of material on that particular slide, and we only have 5 minutes. Could we go through some of the questions or some of the responses from your colleagues?
Yes. Let's see. One of them, we already went over this, but it was the importance of aftercare, emotional and physical, and the role of ongoing consent.
And by the way, I think that's brilliant for every relationship.
So I feel like we touched on that one. Consent practices are much stronger among kinksters than it is with vanillas, and more robust. Which I think we touched on that too.
Yeah, we touched on that a bit.
Let's see, the division between kink and penetrative, they're referring to normal sex as penetrative sex, is news to most.
Okay, we've touched on it a little bit, but let's wrap about the penetrative discourse issue. One of the things we didn't get to, and I know this, it actually fits into our discourse. Al Verrocchio has a lovely TED Talk about taking up sex not as first base, second base, third base, like this conquering, conquered kind of dynamic that's so common in our culture. But instead to have discourses about, like, sex is a pizza, what toppings do we like? So if I'm with my lover, she's downstairs teaching chemistry, and she and I would talk about the sexy practices that may or may not involve penetrative intercourse at particular times. And so the kinksters are railing and saying, wait, the penetrative intercourse isn't always on our pizza, right? That's not always what we're doing or why we're doing it. And likewise, I think that would be a very helpful discourse for vanillas, right? That what are all these sexy things that you could be doing? And that puts, various forms of non-penetrative touching on the table, acts of service, words of affection and affirmation, right? That puts a lot on our sex pizza that we normally wouldn't think of as sexy.
Which I like to refer to, we talked a little bit about this, that it's a spectrum, just like gender. That it's all points in between, it changes, it's up and down, it's all over the place. There's a lot of, like, it's pizza toppings, there's a lot of different things that you can add to it, and constantly changing.
I really like pineapple on my pizza, but if my lover doesn't, we've got some conversations to have. You know what I mean? So if there are particular practices, etc. So I'm thinking of this couple where she passed out during anal sex and freaked them both out, but there was some, now they get to more explicitly talk about pizza toppings. Great example, thank you.
Should we try to get to another one?
Yeah, let's see if we can, given I want to digress frequently.
Let's see, kink is mentally stimulating as well as physically. We touched on that.
I'd like to explicate on that a little bit more. So, kink involves various physical practices that so-called vanilla sex doesn't necessarily, so therefore it engages us, like how strenuous rope play is. I was quite surprised in working with the kink community as a therapist, how, and this should have made sense as a former boxer and kickboxer, that when you're the dom in a sadomasochistic kind of relationship and you are doing slap play or punching play in as safe a way as you can, how physically exhausting it is for both people, because getting hit is exhausting and doing the hitting is exhausting, so it's cathartic for both. So there's the physical play. Rope work, you're a master of geometry. You know what I mean? Like, you got to figure out how the angles are going to work, how the curves are going to work, not only to have the aesthetic appearance you want, but also to do so in a safe way.
Well, it's knowing with that too, which I'm putting a lot of emphasis on rope because I do it myself, but it is extremely dangerous too. That, I mean, I've had people message me all the time of, hey, I'm getting this rope, what do I need to buy? Like, what? Like, please slow down.
Yeah,
like,
there is a dozen steps before buying the rope.
Yeah, like it terrifies me because I did only floor work, learning tensions and different knots for almost 2 years before I started suspending. Because there's L frictions, there's X frictions, there's your half hitches, there's your Munster, your bowline, like there's a lot of different things that go into it, and people look at me like, it looks so serene, like, it hurts. I'm from yesterday, I'm still in pain, but I know the risk.
Well, and it's interesting that, again, as a therapist, I'm like, is this self-mutilation? You know what I mean? Because that's what we're used to as therapists. And you're like, no, Matt, these are bruises.
Well, and think of it too, if you go and do a hard workout, you're sore the next day.
I'm sore right now.
That's part of what it is, that I'm pulling myself up with my core or with one arm or holding my weight, that my muscles are sore too.
And my sore feet, your sore ribs, right? that's a different kind of workout.
Yeah. And so the physically stimulated can happen on both sides. You know, the mental part too, it's that connection, it's that vulnerability, it's talking about consent, it's that intimacy that is very difficult, that it's mentally stimulating, and a lot of it too on, you know, how to breathe through it, that it's meditative. Like if you have someone doing whip play, you know, getting whipped in the back or on the butt or whatever it is, that you'll tense up thinking it's coming and it's not, and it almost becomes playful and you'll kind of laugh and giggle, and then it comes and oh shit, it hurts. That's a lot of, you know, calming your breath and being aware of it and feeling through the pain.
Why am I so exhausted when I leave the dentist? You know what I mean?
Tense.
Exactly. It's that one of those where I'm sure somebody has a dental fetish somewhere, but that where I have to be aware of my breathing, aware of my body, and aware of how exhausting it is, right? And so in a much more pleasant way, that some kink activities might inform that as well, right? That tension and the cathartic release. So I'm sorry we didn't get to more of the statements.
We got through the good ones though.
Okay, we got through the good ones.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Liz, for coming and hanging out with us today. It means a lot to me. And I wish we could do this again, but I have 2 more class periods left is all. So for you all watching, we're going to finish up Foucault and critical psychology and sexuality. And then we'll have a last unit on, we're going to take up a binary to gendered pseudo-normative approach and talk about common psychological issues for boys and girls in our culture, to use those terms prosaically rather than technically. And then the semester will be over. So thanks for watching, guys.